Good afternoon, everyone. This is Griffin Greer with Motility's Professional Services Department. Today we're going to be having a webinar here in just a few minutes. For those of you who are already joined in and dialed in, welcome. We're going to probably hold maybe 2 minutes or so after 1 o'clock to make sure everyone's joined and dialed in. Please keep in mind everyone will be muted through the session. We can have a Q&A period at the end, in which case if you look in your Zoom panel, there should be a little Q&A section where we can not only do question and answers, we can also there's a chat panel as well if you have any questions. But I would advise to just hold questions until the end. That way we can go through the meeting start to finish, and then we can go through and follow up with everyone. So again, like I said, this is Griffin. Give it a few minutes here. We'll probably start around 1:02 or so just to make sure anyone else joining has some time to get logged in. Okay? We'll get started in just a minute. Thank you. Hello again, everyone. This is Griffin here for those of you just joining. We're going to hold a few minutes here to just make sure everyone gets logged in and dialed in all right. So like I said, we'll get started in just a minute. Thank you for holding. All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Again, this is Griffin with Motility Software's Professional Services Department. Today we're going to be hosting our first of many, what we're calling our Motility Coffee Break webinar series. Typically going over a couple of items in accounting, and then as we move on, we'll jump into the other modules in later months. But for the first couple sessions, it's going to be primarily accounting-based. So, hopefully that's of relevance to you all who have joined. So typically how we're going to host these, I'll go ahead and run through the sessions. For example, today's is covering auto check writing and the check approvals enhancement. And in each session we'll go over a topic, typically maybe spend about 15-20 minutes going through it. We'll leave the last bit of time for Q&A. So I would suggest either holding your questions, or if you want to post them into the Q&A panel in Zoom, you can go ahead and do so, and I will get to them at the end. And regarding the chat panel as well, you can utilize that, but I won't be answering any questions until the end of the session. So, and we may have a few participants join middle of the session, but I don't want to keep anyone waiting. Let's go ahead and get started. So, if there's any issues with the audio or the video or anything, please let me know. We will be recording and posting these, so keep in mind if you ever want to reference back, you can. But I should have on my screen shared my session. And I'll go ahead and navigate over to accounting, where we'll begin reviewing auto check writing and check approvals within the software. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our accounting module. Now I've already got approvals set up on the checking account that I will be writing from today. I can show you that once we're finished so you can see where to set those things up. But the idea is that today we know a lot of dealerships' approvals process can either be an AP personnel getting the checks printed but without a signature on them, in which case they will land on a CFO or the owner's desk. They will go through their notes, make sure all the invoices they've shown to pay, match up, and they will go ahead and sign the check and get those drafted out. Now, we know that can be time consuming, and many times that CFO or owner is mobile and needs to be able to do this process either remotely, or some way so where the electronic signature can be posted, but still require approval, so no one's just running AP checks without anyone else having a chance to look over them. So that's intended, what this enhancement is intended to do, in which case we'll show it. And really the best way I think of processing a batch for those of you who are cutting individual checks is actually utilizing our auto check writer to help consolidate and show you what is outstanding in your accounts payable. Obviously we have a lot of reports like your AP aging, the AP transactions reporting that can help assist you, but if everyone is keying in the payables at the appropriate times that you're invoiced and the due dates are correctly entered, you're going to find that hopefully the auto check writer points you in the direction as to what is due in the current period or due through the current pay period that you're writing checks for. So let me show you an example of that and how you can utilize this auto check writing process to hopefully increase the efficiency of your AP department. So I will start, like always, going to the Write Checks and Drafts. And first, I will pick one of my checking accounts that we will be writing from. And today, we will be using our Riverbank Trust account. So we'll hit OK, and we're in here. It looks like this month I have a voided check out there that was never drafted and assigned a check number. And that's what we're seeing here on the left is all checks for the current month and year. So today, we are looking at December 2019. Let's say I close November a couple days into the month, and we've gone ahead and our current month is now December. So I want to go ahead and do a auto check writing batch. So I'm going to click the auto check writing button down here at the bottom. And the first thing it's going to do is you're going to look over here on the left and you're going to see a small panel where you can put in some filters. So you may be writing checks for just one of your rooftops, in which case you can choose a certain profit center. Or payables due through a certain rooftop. But in this case, I'm going to leave it blank. I want to run all payables for all stores. You can also do a range of entities here. So if I wanted to put in all entities from, let's say your starting number was 100,000 and you're only in the 400,000s, but you just want to make sure you grab everything, you could do something like this. However, the system is already searching all entities for you, unless, of course, you're looking for just a specific range to pay. So I would also advise, just leaving those blank in case you need to. One of the good filters you may use here, though, is the GL account. If you have multiple accounts payable accounts and you pay out separately or you do runs at different times of the month for these particular AP runs, you could use a different account here. So if my default account was 2,000, again, no need to plug it in. The system's going to automatically pull AP balances for all account type accounts payable. And those are assigned in the Add Modified GL account screen. So if I did want to pay a specific account, let's say my titling account was 2110, and we needed to run a specific run there, you could obviously specify that GL. But also in this case, I'm going to run it blank. Lastly, we've got the ending due date. This is going to be relevant for those of you who are putting in your payables and plugging a due date in. Now, you can have it set up so that the due date defaults to a net 30 beyond when the invoice date is, or the transaction date that's pushed into accounting. But in this case, let's go ahead and say we want to run payables through that are due through the end of the year, right? I want to make sure we're all paid up. That way, when we close our books for 2019, our balance sheet is reconciled appropriately. And the virtual credit card checkbox is for dealerships who are set up to do a virtual, draft. And if you're curious about that functionality, you can reach out to your sales representative to get more info on that. There's also going to be another enhancement here that you're going to see that you may be interested in which case we're offering demos for, and that's our Motility Pay enhancement. But we'll get to that in just a moment. So really, all I've specified here in my auto check writing draft is an ending due date to make sure that we capture all payables that have been keyed in due through the end of this month. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the Proceed to Check Writing button. So you saw a little counter there. What that was is it was accruing all of the outstanding vendors that we have payables to. Okay, so doesn't mean that these are the checks that are going to be cut immediately, right? You still have the opportunity to intervene here because due to cash flow purposes or just, whatever your due date terms are with one of these vendors, you may not need to pay them in this check run, right? For conserving cash flow purposes, especially for the holiday, maybe your Coast transaction isn't due until the following month, in which case you would hold off on paying that, or maybe you haven't received the final invoice, including the freight for the parts that were shipped from Coast. But in this case, we did put a due date due through the 31st, and you can see where that system has brought that into my filtering here. So now, let's go ahead and go through, and let's see which vendors we want to choose through this run. So I may have a stack of invoices on my desk here that I want to confirm, and let's go through one vendor at a time. So we'll start with our American Guardian, and none of my American Guardian invoice are due through, or there we go. It just took a second to populate. So right here we have a transaction ID 141223. That should be the invoice number I'm receiving from American Guardian. I show $123.17 total due through this period. Now there could be other outstanding payables assigned to American Guardian. However, they're not due in the period that we've specified, so we can go ahead and ignore those. But if we did run another auto check writing batch and didn't include the due date, we could potentially see more invoice lines here. So, if that due date functionality seems to be restricting your payables, you may want to get with the team who is keying in your invoices and make sure that they are putting in due dates appropriately. Otherwise, you could look at the vendor's entity profile, and on their AP Info tab, there's a net 30 field, which you could then populate so that the system will automatically assign a due date based on what you plug in there. So if I put an invoice in the system on December 1st and they have a net 30 set up for them, then the due date should automatically transcribe to 12/31/2019. In this case, we'll go ahead and hit pay. We will save the check. Otherwise, it will prompt me to save when I move on, but that's it. So this check is ready to be push through in the batch. So we'll go to our next, Advance Auto. We have another one due on the 26th of the month, so we'll go ahead and mark that one as paid, and that matches my invoice total, so there's no research there. Save and move on. So as you can see, I'm basically just working through my payables as if I were doing one check at a time. But since they're all provided to me in the auto check writing batch, it's just much faster than having to search up an entity, start a new check, and load the check stock into the printer, print it. It's much easier to get all of these prepared and ready to go, then send the print queue so they all print at once. Now, in the case of this Batteries by Fisher, maybe I don't have this invoice or the total is missing. I don't know where this balance came from. I'm looking through my notes. I don't see an invoice with that reference number. I could use the V button here where I could find where that transaction came from. But since I can't find the physical invoice from Batteries by Fisher, I'm going to hold off. I don't want to pay them in this run, and I might hold off. Considering we still have a couple days until the due date, I might want to confirm and make sure this is correct. So I'm going to move on from Batteries. And as you can see, each time I mark a check to be paid, you can see that final amount here, but it's still not printed yet. So this is kind of your reference as to who I've marked to pay in this run versus who is we're going to hold them. And if I don't pay Batteries by Fisher, this amount is simply going to stay in payables until I run another check run or I manually write that check by hand, or a one-off instead of using the auto check writing. But again, we'll continue. Coast, this is a negative $5,000 balance from Coast. It seems a bit high to be some sort of credit memo in my parts, so I'm going to leave that one alone to let my accounting staff do some research before we decide to, apply that to a future Coast invoice. In this case, I do have the Diamond Fleet parts. I see their invoice number here. We'll go ahead and mark that one paid, save, and move on. So we're going to make our way through. I'm going to mark a few more. We'll do again, another one here, negative 7,000. That's not something I'd like to, apply against, considering I don't have any other invoices to apply that credit memo for. So we'll move on. Here it looks like in my interstate battery, I did get a core return that will apply against my invoice. So I'll go ahead and get those taken care of. Save and move on. $1,000 for our protective. It's one of the products we offer. And then this last one here for Yellowstone, we'll mark that one paid. So I have flagged, in the case of this screen here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 checks to print. Okay, so instead of doing any of those one by one, I now have 8 checks ready to go. So if I went ahead and loaded my check printer, I could run this by hitting the Motility or the print checks, and that's going to go ahead and trigger that print queue. However, let's talk about some of the reports you have available to you, and then of course our approvals process, which has been revamped and now should hopefully help assist bringing that process into the software. So in this case, we've got a few reports here. So I'm going to click on each of them so you can see what they do. You may be familiar with these previously, but just so make sure everyone is on the same page. The print invoices due. This is something you could even print before we go through and start marking these checks. And the reason why is this is going to be an aggregate of all of the vendors out there who have payables and their due dates. Okay? So this would be something to confirm what you're running here. You know, and you know, maybe by hand you want to cross-reference the invoices you have compared against, you know, what's in the system. So that would be something you could do first, but I've already kind of done that process and gone line by line, invoice by invoice. So, you know, that one, you know, usually is only going to be if you aren't doing approvals through the software or you just want to manually go line by line and decide what you want to pay. But we've already done that, so we'll move on to the next report. This is typically the one you're going to want to print prior to printing any batch, whether it's a Motility Pay batch or a print checks batch, simply because this is a reference to exactly what we've agreed to pay. So if I hit Print Invoices Selected, we're going to see each of these, and I'm going to try to minimize this so you can see it here. But we should have a line item for each vendor we've chosen to pay. So here's American Guardians. Here's the invoice number that we've chosen to pay, when it was due, and the amount we've agreed to. And that seems to look, it agrees with our totals here, as should the rest of them. So basically, this Invoices Selected report is a summary of everything you've gone through and chosen, yes, this is what we want to pay. So when our account is drafted, when we go ahead and print all these checks, that is the amount that we'd be awaiting to clear once our vendors start submitting and depositing those checks. So this is a great reference for you to have, at least filed away for accounting purposes, just so you can confirm exactly when the checks went out, in what amounts, and the total amount for that batch. Just a nice extra accountability there. So I would print this, file it away with potentially my remittance, and we'd be good there. So that's the purpose of that report. We have a print remittance here. Okay, so you can print that, and you're going to kind of get the same information as we did on the last, the print invoices selected, but you're obviously going to have more of the check remittance side. Now, the case of this, however, is we don't have a check number generated yet. So if I go to print my remittance here, we're kind of waiting until these have all been applied. You can always reprint the remittance after a batch has been created, so you can get that total. But as you can see here, check number is yet to be applied. We haven't printed and ran the checks yet. But they should run sequentially, right? So if I go up here at the top, American Guardian is first in the list. They should be assigned my next check number, and I can confirm that number by looking over here, getting out of the remittance, and seeing our next check number up here at the top. So American Guardian's check would be 1009, Advance Auto would be 1010, etc., all the way through. But you can always reprint a final remittance after the run has been printed so that you do have the check numbers to reference, and that report can be found in our accounting reports, kind of where our checks by suppliers are, which we can also show. So we've gone through the process. We validated what we want to pay. It's matched up to our invoice totals, so we're ready to go. However, we have now two options. We have a program we're calling Motility Pay, which is an automated check writing enhancement to the software where we're essentially taking care of the checks, the ACHs, and the potential virtual credit cards for you. So you would hit that Motility Pay button. The checks get submitted to us electronically. We go ahead and prep them, ship them out, and everything is pretty kosher on your end. So if that's something you all are interested in, you can sign up for a demo by reaching out to your sales rep, just requesting a Motility Pay demo, and we can go through the whole the demo process with you. It's pretty short, but the idea is not only are we putting time back into your accounts payable personnel's day, the labor of taking the checks, printing them, taking them out, and getting them mailed out. Since we're handling all that for you, not only is it a time savings, but also there's a rebate program back into it as well, where you can get a a kickback on all the vendors who accept virtual credit cards, in which case the program essentially pays for itself, but in reality we are guaranteeing that your first year you're using Motility Pay is no cost to you, right? That rebate should cover it, and now you're not manually cutting checks. So not to spend too much time on that, but if you're interested, there will be an additional webinar on that, as well as any information you request from your sales rep. They can provide that. So we're going to go ahead and actually just do the normal print checks routine here. But watch what happens if I go to hit print checks. The system will not let me proceed because I have an approval required on this checking account. And you can validate that by looking down here, approvals 0 of 1. Now I could set multiple approvals up so that I would require 2 separate individuals to approve before I could print these checks. But typically you may only have one approver, but the approver is not the person writing the checks. That way no one is just approving and sending out checks with anyone else knowing. So now I'm in a stopping point as an AP personnel. I need to get approval to actually print all these. So what I can do is instead of, I can't really continue, but I don't want to start my batch over, right, which you don't have to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit request approval. Now what this is going to do is anyone who is approved to approve checks, they're going to get an email that says you have checks needing your approval. And this is a permission. So in our security module, there's a permission that allows a user to approve checks, in which case their email would auto-populate up in the top here. Okay? So this is a great way, so without you having to chase down your CFO or your owner who is going to need to approve these checks, you can simply shoot them an email automatically, and that'll go over to them. So now I'm going to kind of switch roles here and become the approver, right? So I'm going about my day, and I received an email telling me I have checks needing approval. So let's go ahead and handle that. So I'm going to jump out of this screen as an AP personnel. You can leave a batch, and it will stay in there as you had it until you decide to either cancel that batch or go ahead and print it. And in this case, we cannot print due to the approval side. So I'd like to focus your attention now to a new banking utility we've added. So this is going to be a new update to the accounting module, and it's our check approvals dashboard. So now, instead of having a physical stack of checks on your desk, especially because, one, we haven't printed them yet, but getting ahead of it, if I open up my check approvals, all checks in the system that have not been approved and have not been printed will show here. Okay, but maybe there's some additional checks in here. You can see some dates here that don't align with our current batch. So you can always use the batch screen up here at the top to isolate currently the batch you have outstanding. Okay, so to do that, I will just select batch, and now if you look here, we have our 8 vendors that we've chosen to pay in the dollar amounts that are agreeing against our invoices selected report, and now I am responsible for going through and approving these. Okay, so you can see some of the information here, where it came from, the checking account we're writing out of, the check date, their amounts, addresses to the vendors, any comments or memos tied with those checks. So I didn't put in any account information or comments as to what was being paid, but those will obviously come over here too. And eventually, right now I don't have any invoices tied with these transactions, but you'll be able to hit this plus sign, and the V button that you all may be familiar with in our accounting system, you'll be able to view or jump directly to the invoice that generated that AP balance. So if I have receiving tickets that I need to confirm against, you'll be able to navigate to those from this screen. But hopefully the AP personnel has done that ahead of time, and typically you're just going here and approving based on what you know you spent some of the dealership's cash flow on. So to approve, you can go one by one here, hit the approve button, and if I click out of there, you'll see that it is a confirmation by the color that's changed. So I could go through one by one and approve, or there is an approve all button here. And you can also filter out items that have been approved. So if you had a couple hundred checks in here at one time and you wanted to remove out the ones you've already marked approved, you could just hit the Need Approval button and that will filter those out. You can also see checks that have just been approved but not quite printed yet, because once a check has been both approved and printed, you will not see it in the screen, right? There's no sense in leaving an approval reference here because it has already been printed, ready to go. So In this case, we're going to go ahead and validate. Yes, we confirm that we want to approve all of these checks. And I've got all of them ready to go, so I'm good. I'm done. I don't have to sign each one individually. Obviously you still want to make sure you're referencing the invoices that generated those balances, but now it's a system, or it's an enhancement that you can do completely within the software. And since the AP personnel have notified you electronically via an email, they don't even have to leave their office. You can just get that email, approve all those checks, and then you're done with it. So now I'm going to flip back over to my AP personnel role because now I've received notification that all my checks have been approved, and I'm going to go back into the check writing draft, and the system actually prompts you anytime you have an outstanding auto check writing batch that, hey, you've got a batch open, make sure not to double pay an entity by making a manual one-off check and printing it, but then also printing a check in that batch. So that's just what that reminder is for. So now we're going to go right back to where we were. We're going to enter back into our Riverbank Trust. If you click the auto check writing box again, the system's going to prompt you. And I would say make sure you do read the full detail here, because the system's asking you, you already have an auto batch started. Do you want to clear the current batch and start a new one? If I said yes here, the system's going to undo all of the progress we made in terms of the checks we marked printed or to print and the checks that we approved as the CFO. So I'm going to hit no here because I don't want to start a new one. I want to get right back to where I was. And if you can see that, we're right back to where we were. Same amounts, same everything. We just want to go ahead and now hit print checks. The system will prompt to make sure you're confirmed with the final save changes there. And now I'm going to get a print queue. I'm getting some print errors here. I don't actually have a printer hooked up to this machine, but in this case, you would have loaded your check stock into the printer and generated that batch. So now we can see that any of those checks, they've been marked here, and that would be it. That's the entire auto check writing, including the new check approvals enhancement. A couple questions that come up, which would be, how do you set approvals up on your bank account? So why don't we go do that, and then if there's any follow-up questions, that's pretty much what the remaining time in our webinar will be reserved for, is any Q&A or just anything related to auto check writing and or check approvals. But in this case, I do want to show you where you can set up both the approvals and then the security. So I'm going to go over to our CRM. For those of you familiar with check writing in the software, you know that there's a bank entity within our CRM. That is where you go typically to change your check number if your check number gets out of sequence. So we'll go over here. I'm going to go find my Riverbank entity. Easiest way for me to find banks typically, rather than trying to find their entity number or search it up by the exact name, is I'll do an advanced search within the software. I will hit Show Only Banks and hit OK. And now that should limit my list down so I'm not hunting so much for my banks. In this case, I see Riverbank right there. We're going to hit OK, and that should bring us over to that entity. From here, we'll go to AP Info. The checking account info, whether it's your routing, your accounting number, your check number, your bank logo, all of that information is always stored here within this checking account info button. So I'll go ahead and hit that. And the checking account we were using today, I believe, was 1013 or 1012. So I'll navigate to that since this is a different checking account here. There's the main checking account. We'll go over one more. There it is. So we printed 7 checks. That looks right with our next in sequence check number. And if you look here, the approval signatures is set up right there. So if you put a number there, that means the system is requiring one signature. If I put 3 here, it's going to require 3 different users to approve those checks. So unless you have like a 2 or more approvers, typically 1 is all that you're going to need here. So you'd hit Apply to save it, OK, and now going forward, you cannot print a check out of that checking account without it being marked approved by an approver. To approve a check, or to gain the security permissions to approve a check, we're going to need to go into our security module. And this is something you can request from our support team if you don't control your securities on your own. Otherwise, if you are familiar with our security module, you can always do this yourselves by navigating to the security profile of the user you want to have the approval access. And we'll go to Permissions. I will navigate, I believe it should be in the iAccounting module, but sometimes just for ease of searching here, I'll do All, and then I will type in Approve. And if you look up right there at the top, I'll even filter down a bit more, allowed to approve checks, and in which case I do have this permission currently. So that's why I was able to do that without having to log out and log into another user profile. So, you know, you could have an AP personnel have the ability to approve their own checks, but also prevent other AP personnel from printing without that particular individual's approval, but they would need this permission alongside the ability to write checks to do both. Or you would have it separated so that only one individual could approve, but they can't print checks, whereas the other individual could print checks, but they can't, you know, or they can't print or approve, or I'm sorry, print without the appropriate approvals. So that should help assist with allowing us to not only use the Motility Pay enhancement so that checks are being sent out, but only with your approval, but without having to manually sign the checks that you may have to do today to get that going. So that's all. If you do have any or need any assistance getting that set up for the approval side, you can get with our support team. Otherwise, auto check writing is within the software today. You should be able to, if you're not currently utilizing it, I highly advise doing so because it makes writing your checks and doing runs you know, a bit easier than going one by one. So a couple common questions as I either wait for Q&A to come up, or hopefully, you know, this was straightforward enough. There aren't too many follow-up questions. But a couple questions that come up is, you know, I went into my auto check writer, and I went in to do a batch, and I'm going to do a new one here. And let's say you go to run this screen and you hit Proceed to Check Writing, you don't find anything. That means that there's no payables out there, or at least payables within the given due date range that the system is finding. You need to be utilizing an accounts payable account for this auto check writing to be utilized. If you're, you know, directly writing your checks directly to an expense of some sort, you won't be able to utilize this because you're just keying them in as they come in, and you don't have the forecasting that you would have if you get those into payables first, because now on your balance sheet you're going to be able to notate, here's, you know, our outgoing transactions via AP, here's our incoming via AR, to give you a better idea of the cash flow available to you in the current period. So I would heavily advise, if you are not putting payables in today, to do so you can utilize this auto check writing screen. The easiest way to do that, if it's not a parts receiving ticket, which automatically generates payable balances, you can always key in additional APs by going to your Tools, General PO, and then, of course, creating those. So I won't go too far in depth there, but anytime you have a stack of invoices there, you're going to want to, oh, I don't have my printer set up for it, so won't let me. But that's the whole of our webinar for today's auto check writing and accounting. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to use our chat panel or our Q&A session today to do so. Otherwise, that's pretty much all I've got. So hopefully it's pretty straightforward and easy. Feel free to go generate an auto check writing batch yourselves. If you don't want to finalize it and hit print, just hit cancel checks at the bottom, and then that'll put you back to 0, you know, and nothing will have changed, or no APs will have been you know, written out. So keep in mind, if you have questions on it, or you know, might need a further assistance with going through it, definitely reach out to our support team, and they can let us know. So we do have one question that has come through from an anonymous attendee, and I'll go ahead and describe the question out, and then I can answer it. So the question is, are you able to change the check start number each time you do a batch? For example, if you had some older check stock you located and you wanted to use it, then go back to current stock. Absolutely. So just before starting your batch, again, like we talked about with pulling up the bank over here, you can reset your batch, or I'm sorry, your starting check number from here at any time. So if you do, again, locate those, you know, and you want to go ahead and restart that number, so let me just show you an example of it. So right now on the checking account we just utilized, our starting check number is 1,025, but maybe I found some old 3-digit stock starting at 987. in which case I would change that here. We'll go back over into accounting with our program shortcut, and then you'll see that should backdate our starting check number to an earlier reference. So we'll go right back into where we were. We will use that same checking account we chose earlier, and you can see now my next check number has gone back to 987. If you do locate or you utilize all of that check stock, let's say you cut 5 checks, you do a batch for 5, and now you need to jump back out, of course, just close the check writing screen, go back to your entity. We'll update this back to 1025 where it was, apply it, and now we'll go back in, and as soon as we enter back into that checking account, you may need to relaunch accounting to kind of have it refresh, and typically that's a lot of times what you'll find in the software. But as long as that is saved, oh, you know what? Nope, it probably didn't even need a refresh. I made a mistake there. I changed my previous or a different checking account number. So I would want to go double check where our stock is at in there. I think it was somewhere in these sequences, but it's a demo environment, so it looks like I can mess it up, no problem. But in this case, this is where we would want to bring it back to the 1025. So 1025, we will update that back. Now we will return to accounting, and it should have updated. And I don't believe you need to close the module. I think you just close out of the check writing screen to have that update, but we'll confirm here. Picking my Riverbank Trust, and then we're right back to where we were. So you're just navigating that check number from the bank entity. Feel free to change it at any time. I hope that answers your question. We do have another question that's come through. Most of the examples you showed only had 1 or 2 items to pay. Can you unselect some of the items if you wanted to hold payment on any invoice? So, and this is a good question because let's say some of your checks come back and they have not been approved, right? We can't submit a batch without approving each of the checks in there. So that's a good question. Let's go back through. I'm going to create a new Riverbank batch to run. We're going to do the same thing. Let's do an ending due date, end of the month, proceed to check writing. And if you notice, my vendor list is much shorter because we did pay the only outstanding invoice that some of them had. But in this example, can you unselect one of them if you wanted to hold payment? So let's say I went through my batch, and let's check to see if there's anything. American Guardian, let's see. Coast, let's do this batteries by Fisher because that was one we didn't run last time. As a matter of fact, if I take the due date out of here, now I don't have any additional payables, but let's try this. Let's do a pay, to generate that balance. And let's say, we've gone through, we requested approval, we went through, we did our amount here, and we'll just do another American Guardian amount here if we had a second invoice for them. So now I've got two balances in here, and let's say we went ahead and requested approval, and my owner or my CFO went through and approved the batteries by Fisher, and they said, you know what, we're not approving this American Guardian because we just saw that in our last batch. So this is either a duplicate balance that we need to research and delete or remove, find out why it was duplicated, but either way, it is not approved. So, the approvals, you can also verify which checks were approved here. So since I have both the permissions, I can go in here and I can actually approve right from the screen. So this is something that can be done one at a time, but obviously the check approval screen is a much better way or a dashboard to do that. But so this one is approved, while as this American Guardian duplicate is not. If that's the case, and we do want to go in here and continue my batch, but with disincluding the American Guardian one, you can do this and zero out the check amount here. That has zeroed out the first transaction line, in which case I would just want to remove the additional payment line here to disinclude clearing that payable. So I've reset this check back to 0. So now you can save, and now when I run my Motility Pay batch, my auto check writing batch, it will not continue forward with this check. It will leave in the accounts payable the amount due here. So if I went ahead and went print checks, that would continue forward. You can see my amount has updated now. So now when I do my run, only one check will print out here since I have chosen to exclude the American Guardian one simply because for whatever reason the owner or the CFO did not approve this, so we're not going to include it in this batch. And maybe we'll do some research as to why there's a duplicate in there. Does that answer your question or make sense? And you can respond back in the chat panel too. I don't know if you can respond directly to questions or not, but I hope that that did answer that. So, and you have full control over, can you hold payment on one of the invoices? Okay, so if you owed 5 invoices to a vendor, can you hold one payment on one of those invoices? So the check, one check is going out with a single check status, and you know there is a stop payment. So they're all tied to the one check. So if you do agree and mark pay on that check and you hit print, it is going to include that amount on there. So I would say if you've got 5 line items here of invoices to pay for American Guardian, just don't include the one of the 5 that you're not going to pay. Otherwise, it will be included on the check. So really, that's the final amount is if you've paid on 4 of the 5, only those 4 will be paid. And then, you know, but it's by check. So what you could do is for that 5th payment that you want to hold payment on, you could generate a check for that. So for example, let's do that manually. I'm going to cancel my batch here. And we'll kind of start over. And now let's say for that American Guardian check, that's exactly what we want to do. I can generate a check. We'll find American Guardian here. Hopefully I can spell that right. There we go. And this is the amount we wanted to do the stop payment on. That would be setting that up as a separate check and marking that one specifically as stop payment. Since the checks only have one status, you know, you would have to do a separate individual line or for that particular one to exclude it from the batch. Otherwise, just simply don't select it and it will stay in payables. And then when you do a stop payment, that will generate a where you want the offsetting transaction to go. So where do you want your void going typically, or your stop payment typically into the same month that the first check was generated from. We have another question here. Can you do an EFT batch that will not assign a check number for each payment? So what you can do is when you're writing the checks here, we'll go ahead and let's start right over. We'll go right back in. We will begin a new auto check writing batch. And we will go ahead and do the same thing, proceed to check writing. I'm running out of payables here to pay. But since I didn't save those last 2 and print them, they're still in here. What you can do is each check, you can mark the auto draft button. And you see here, after I click that box, it grays out. But when you check the box and then either tab out of the field, typically I'll tab out, or if you just click somewhere else, like if I click into the memo, it opens the check number field up. So now instead of using your next available check number, you could do EFT 12.04.19. And then that would reference that particular, you know, electronic funds transfer or ACH or whatever type of transaction that is. So now when we save that check and move on, that one, you know, we'll use this number. It will skip in sequence. So for example, American Guardian would be assigned check number 1025. The batteries by Fisher would be the EFT 12.04.19, and then our check sequence would pick back up on the next non-auto draft check. So as long as you're marking your checks as auto draft and then putting in the correct information here, or I could do the same date but then a 1 after it so it is slightly unique, that would handle that. So I hope that answers your question. But short answer is yes. Long answer was me just trying to show that's where you would assign that. So the next check number will only assign to checks not marked as auto draft, in which case that's the number it's going to populate there. But good questions, thank you. Hopefully that's, you know, answering some stuff that you might have been sitting on your mind. It's not technically related to check approvals, but it's, hey, you know, how do we do this? Which is like, you know, like changing the check number, those things just, since they're in a different screen, sometimes it's a bit trickier to know where those are. But anything you need to modify with the bank account itself will always be on the bank entity here. And like I mentioned, the checking account info. For those of you who, you know, want to print, I've had a couple requests, and not to go too off topic, but sometimes these questions could also be, you know, on your mind, is if you ever wanted to add a second signature line to your checks, you can do so by including an additional signature image that has a second line on it. We actually have one here, so if that's ever something you all were interested in, you could reach out to our support team and they can provide that to you. But all they would be doing is adding a second signature line if you did require 2 signatures to, you know, to get a check out. or your bank's logo. Pretty much everything controlled with what goes onto your checks is from this screen. So if there's ever anything you've been wanting, like a logo change or that second signature like I talked about, this would be the screen to do that. Okay? We have another question here from Pat. So how do you handle a negative amount? Checks cannot be written for less than 0. So typically what you're going to do with those transactions, like for example the ones that I showed here, so let's just talk about this Coast one. Normally with a negative balance like that, you're looking to reconcile it against an existing AP to bring that balance down. So kind of like a credit memo where, if I had a couple outstanding invoices to, represent, hey, we're knocking $5,000 off of my other invoices owed to Coast, you could do so. In this case, we cannot, right? There is a negative, there's nothing else to apply this to. And if we don't have any future business with Coast, we're never going to have a way to apply that negative amount. And since you can't write a negative check, which Pat, you're 100% correct there, typically you would want to, resolve this through a journal entry of some sort. Either requesting back, you could reach out to Coast and say, hey, we're not, we have nothing to apply this amount against. Can you go ahead and send to us our outstanding balance, which hopefully they would offer a credit check to you. But in this case, if we wanted to, handle that and, hopefully reconcile it in some way, you could do so with a journal entry, which I've seen in the past, where I could take, let me just do a general entry here. And maybe say, let's see here, I'm going to do Coast Credit AR, right? We're expecting to receive that balance in there from Coast. So let's say we call Coast and they say, you know what, you do have an outstanding amount in there, we're going to go ahead and credit that to you. I would take that balance and move it out of AP. Oops, let me use the right AP account here. And here's what I'll typically do. You can always work out of multiple windows on this screen. So I will bring the checks back. Let's go find Coast. So we're going to hit Add, find our Coast entity. Give it a second to load here, our balance. Because I want to reference this transaction to make sure that I'm appropriately moving it out of accounts payable. So we're in here. I may have the wrong Coast here. Let's try. You can see the purpose of having the right entity or why you might want to consolidate your entities. So what this is so I can say, okay, for Coast, our entity number is 69s, so we'll make sure we put 69s in here. What's our reference number? We want to reference the appropriate transaction. In this case, it's called trial balance. So maybe this was an outstanding balance we brought over from a previous system. So we want to make sure that we reconcile this appropriately. And how would we do that? Well, we want to go ahead and debit, it's a negative balance, right? So we're already over on what we have here. So if my thinking is correct, we're going to be crediting this back out. And typically, you'd want to put it into some sort of accounts receivable. Now, I don't know what your AR account types look like or your chart of accounts. In this case, I'm going to say, show me all my accounts receivable accounts. I'm just going to say, just default AR 1140. So same thing, we just want to move this balance from being an accounts payable that we're probably never going to get, if we don't get any future invoices from Coast, we have nothing to apply it against. So in this case now, I want to move the balance into accounts receivable, because if Coast has agreed, we're going to go ahead and pay out that $5,000 owed. Now, what we'll do is I'll go ahead and save that transaction. We'll leave my check writing screen, and let's say a couple days goes by, Coast does send that credit check as they said they would. Now I would just reverse it, and I would go right into the receive pay on accounts instead of my check writer. And now we do the same thing. We'll go ahead and pull up Coast. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's our entity, and right there's our $5,000 that we are expecting to receive. So when that check comes in, now you have a place to receive it against rather than trying to apply it against a negative AP, which is essentially an AR, but we want to do it the right way. And this would be probably the most appropriate way, would be making a journal entry, moving it out of AP, and then applying it somewhere where we can actually receive against, which would be us receiving that when we do receive that check from them. I hope that answers your question. It's kind of a long-winded going through the whole process, but I hope that helps. We have another question from Sue here. It's what is the virtual box under the check number? So this is kind of for what we talked about earlier with Motility Pay. You can have checks that, there's a lot of kind of new advancements in terms of fraud prevention, and virtual credit cards are one of those. So just to talk about a bit about what a virtual credit card is, it's a one-time use 16-digit card number that can be generated for each transaction. So let's say you owe $500 to NTP. Instead of giving them your card number on file or putting your card number into a payment processing portal, you could utilize a virtual credit card through Motility Pay, for example. And what that does is you get a one-time use 16-digit number in the exact amount of the invoice that gets sent to NTP, or you could plug into NTP's payment processor to represent what you're paying. So instead of cutting an actual check, you're doing a quote-unquote credit card payment, but it's not a real card. It's just a one-time use. So dealerships that are utilizing this technology, either through Motility Pay or through other means, can mark specific transactions or quote-unquote checks as virtual credit cards, right? Because there wouldn't be an actual card number here. If I go in and I kind of do the same thing, let's see if I have any payables against myself here. Probably do. So here's Griffin. Doesn't look like it. Let's check one of my other entities. Maybe I'm bad about consolidating. And here I am not finding any payable balances. So why don't we do what I said earlier? We'll start a new batch, generate some checks. So now, if we paid Batteries by Fisher this $4,000 amount, not with a check but through a virtual credit card, we could check that off and utilize the card number that's on file with them. However, they're not currently set up to accept virtual credit card payments, so they're not available to do so. If this is something you're interested in, this ties in with our new Motility Pay enhancement, which hopefully should streamline your AP processes and hopefully make them more efficient. So if you are interested in setting up vendors or setting up your terms with your vendors on a virtual credit card payment system, let our team know, or you can even reach out to your suppliers themselves and see if that's something they accept. Some do, some don't, but that's where we see the industry trending, is getting away from receiving a paper check, depositing it, waiting for it to clear. Why wouldn't a vendor just want to get that payment card processed immediately and have those funds transferred to their account same day rather than waiting for any sort of clear hold, if that makes sense. So yeah, I would advise either reaching out to your sales rep for a Motility Pay demo or other information regarding virtual credit cards, and they should be able to provide that information to you. I hope that answers your question, Sue. So I haven't seen a few other questions come through. I am going to go ahead and leave up the session here, and I will be happy to respond back to anything that's coming in. For those of you who don't have any further questions, I appreciate your time spending with us today. Hopefully this was good information for you. We will be hosting these at 1 p.m. Eastern every Wednesday for the next couple weeks. I would say rolling into January and almost even into February, we're going to be doing these webinars. And to my knowledge, they are all accounting related. So whether it's restricting posting your month or closing your months, to running audit reports, to Motility Pay, for example, anything new that has come out or might be underutilized today at your dealership, we want to make sure everyone's aware of what's available to you, and hopefully the session plays out the same way this one did. Not only did we go through two new features, or one new feature, the check approvals, and then the existing auto check writing feature, but hopefully I answered some questions, not entirely related to those two processes, but linked in, right? Changing the check number, doing an auto draft check that you can assign the check number rather than using the next in sequence, and the hold payment thing that I showed. So hopefully that was helpful to you all. If there's any follow-ups, let our team know. Either reach out through support and say, hey, this guy on the webinar was talking about something, I had no idea what it was, and we can reach out and do some one-on-one. But hopefully they're pretty streamlined, and we hope that each of them are as engaged as this one is. So I thank you all for the questions you did give. Those are all great. Hopefully, different dealerships are able to learn, how others are doing things, or hopefully the questions that were asked would assist not just yourselves, but hopefully the other attendees. So But thank you all again. Like I said, I'm going to leave the session open for another 7 minutes here or so. If anything else comes through, I'm happy to answer it. Otherwise, thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thank you.